Hola, buenos días, muy buenos días a todos los miembros de la Red de Gobernanza Metropolitana. Buenas tardes en Sudamérica y buenas noches en Europa. A la comunidad del Colegio de Jalisco, muy buenos días, gracias por acompañarnos. Y por supuesto al público en general, le damos la bienvenida. Hoy estamos de manteles largos. Tenemos a un distinguidísimo conferencista magistral, el profesor Rod Rhodes, quien nos impartirá la conferencia Governance, Trends and Issues, Speaking Notes. Quiero comentar con ustedes que el profesor Luis Aguilar Villanueva, cofundador de la red y miembro del Comité Técnico Académico de la Red de Gobernanza Metropolitana, en su vasta e importante obra sobre políticas públicas y gobernanza, nos ha dado a conocer desde hace bastante tiempo el pensamiento del profesor Rhodes, por lo tanto es muy familiar para todos nosotros en la red, y eso hace todavía más grande nuestro entusiasmo por escucharlo. Hoy tenemos el honor de tenerlo con nosotros y con una conferencia preparada para nuestro cuarto coloquio internacional de gobernanza metropolitana, repensar la agenda urbana en el contexto de la pandemia. Como responsable técnico de la red, puedo decirles que en este momento nuestra red se encuentra y justo paradójicamente en las circunstancias de pandemia global que son tan complicadas y también en momentos en donde la situación económica desde luego implica recortes financieros, incluyendo a instancias como esta. No obstante todo eso, nos encontramos en un importante momento de madurez que me atrevo a decir nos abre ventanas de oportunidad para que en los próximos años vuelvan ustedes, nuestros amigos de Latinoamérica y de Europa, a reunirse con nosotros en las instalaciones del Colegio de Jalisco. Y justo esta conferencia creo que es un excelente momento para convocarlos y adelantar que el próximo año, sin duda, estaremos en nuestro quinto coloquio internacional y creciendo sin lugar a dudas. Yo no tengo más que compartirles este gran alegría que nos llena, por supuesto, por la conferencia, que enseguida nuestro compañero Álvaro Guevara, también integrante de la red, hará la presentación amplia y nos acompañan el doctor Juan Ángel de Merutis, del Centro Universitario de Arquitectura, Arte y Diseño, y miembro de la red, y el profesor doctor Marco Berger, del Centro Universitario de Economía y Administración de la Universidad de Guadalajara también, quienes van a estar haciendo comentarios a la presentación del profesor Rhodes. Sin más introducción de por medio, dejo la palabra a Álvaro Guevara.
Muchas gracias, doctor Carlos. Queremos darles a todas y todos la bienvenida. Mi intervención será muy breve, únicamente para recordarles que hay dos funciones muy interesantes para todas y todos en esta sala en la que nos encontramos. Reconocerán en la parte de abajo de su pantalla, a mano derecha, un pequeño botón que dice interpretación. La conferencia magistral será mantenida, así como el diálogo posterior dinamizado por el doctor Juan Ángel de Merutis y el doctor Marco Berger, será mantenida en inglés para un mejor diálogo con el profesor Rod Rhodes. Sin embargo, está disponible para todas y todos ese canal de traducción en donde ustedes tendrán una traducción simultánea al español, de manera que pueden ustedes observar, mirar pues la sesión como se está sucediendo, pero escuchando en un canal alternativo la traducción al español. Pueden ustedes estar yendo y viniendo si en algún momento así lo desean. No quiere decir que sea un botón de un mando único, pueden estar yendo y regresando cuando ustedes lo prefieran. Las intervenciones del doctor Marco Berger como del doctor Juan Ángel de Merutis serán también en inglés, por lo cual si prefieren mantenerse en el canal de traducción, bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Finalmente también comentarles que especialmente para las preguntas y los comentarios que estaremos canalizando con el profesor Rhodes, encontrarán su mejor lugar en la parte inferior izquierda de su pantalla, en el recuadro de Q&A. En ese recuadro de Q&A les pedimos que por favor puedan escribir con toda libertad, no hay un mínimo de caracteres, insistiendo en que no es necesario que haya una pregunta por fuerza, puede ser únicamente un comentario que igualmente tanto el doctor Marco Berger como el doctor de Merutis podrán recuperar para el diálogo con el profesor Rhodes, de manera que sería eso lo que tengamos. Cierro comentándoles que en nuestra dinámica vamos a conocer de entrada la conferencia magistral. Enseguida presentaremos los perfiles del doctor Marco Berger y Juan Ángel de Merutis para entonces abrir un diálogo en donde estaremos recuperando sus comentarios y sus preguntas. De manera que quedamos a sus órdenes en el Q&A y también en el canal alternativo de audio en español. Sin más, me permitiré esta vez ya en inglés presentar el perfil académico del doctor Rhodes y enseguida le cedería la palabra para que con gran gusto y honor lo podamos escuchar. Professor Rhodes is Professor of Government at the University of Southampton, United Kingdom, and Director of the Center for Political Ethnography. He is the author or editor of 40 books, including most recently The Art and Craft of Comparison with J. Boswell and J. Colbert, Cambridge University Press. Professor Rhodes also has contributed in Networks, Governance, and the Differentiated Polity Selected Essays, Volume 1, Oxford University Press. Narrative Policy Analysis as editor in 2018, and the Routledge Handbook of Interpretive Political Science, edited with Mark Bevy, Routledge 2015. He has also published some 2,000 articles and chapters in books. He's a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK. In 2015, the ECPR awarded him the Biennial Lifetime Achievement Award for his outstanding contribution on all areas of political science and his exceptional impact of his work. We would like to welcome you, Professor Rhodes, and we are really honored and delighted with your presence here. Be welcome.
Thank you very much. It was very kind of you to invite me. I am delighted to talk to you. Indeed, when people read out the biography, as you have just read out my biography, you'll forgive me, but the one thing it impresses upon me is just how old I am. Now then, I have already circulated, and I'm not quite sure if everybody has seen it, but there is both a full version of the paper and a short version of the paper that I have labeled speaking notes. And I suspect it'll be easier for many people to actually read my remarks at a later date. So rather than boring you to death by actually reading the paper, what I propose to do is to go through the outline of the paper and then illustrate the several points with some little stories of the kinds of field work that I do in this area. Okay. Now then, in the 1990s, my big interest was policy networks and network governance. In the 2000s, my interest switched to the study of interpretive political science. What this paper does is it brings those two interests together. I basically ask myself the question, from the standpoint of the 2000s, how do I make sense of my work in the 1990s? In other words, what would an interpretive political scientist think about network governance? That's what this paper is about, okay? Now, what I propose to do is set the context. I'm not going to assume that everybody knows the stuff on governance. Some of you will, some of you won't. Those of you who know my work on network governance can go to sleep for 10 minutes. The rest of you can catch up over the next 10 minutes. And the first thing I want to do is to point out that over the past, basically since in the UK and Western Europe, since the mid-1980s, there has been a massive change in the way government is run. We used to have old style public administration, which was, it's traditional, it's hierarchical, and the basic idea was we had public servants who advised the elected politician And then when the elected politician had made a decision, the role of the public servant was to implement those decisions. And they used large-scale bureaucracies to do that implementation. Everybody decided, and it's not an opinion I'm wholly in agreement with, but everybody decided that bureaucracies were inefficient. They wasted money, they employed too many people, they did not deliver the services that people wanted, and therefore we got instead, probably the bane of my academic life, the new public management. And I don't know how many of you know the new public management, but you'd have to get yourself an undergraduate textbook to get a list of all the different meanings of this particular phrase. Basically what it means for me is introducing private sector ways of managing into the public sector. So we get the notion that we have got to have performance management by public servants. We get the notion that services are best if they're put out to the private sector and we use markets to deliver services. And there were very big ideas in Britain and throughout Europe. The French, of course, thought it was a lousy idea and paid no attention to this Anglo-Saxon nonsense whatsoever. But the Anglo-Saxons, of course, thought the French were being typically idiotic French. So we both ignored one another, as we've succeeded in doing for centuries. But nonetheless, it was a widespread movement, and the big textbook in the area by Pollitt and Burkhardt actually says the new public management is now an international phenomenon. Everybody's got some version of it for some of the time. But then people began to discover that if you create markets, what you do is you have a multiplication of the number of organizations involved in delivering a service. Now, that happened both big and little in the UK. I'm going to give you a little example of the way in which we had network governance. In the 1980s and then the 1990s, we had the problem of AIDS. And government was not quite sure how to respond to it, especially as the services for people with AIDS were split up between the public sector, national government, the public sector, local government, the public sector, the health service, non-governmental organizations. And all four of them had some role to play in delivering services. So it was decided we needed to bring these services together. So the government offered money for everybody to cooperate with one another to deliver services for people with AIDS. Now, that's the basic policy. Now we switch to my home country, which is Yorkshire, which is, you must have a region in Mexico which thinks it's vastly superior to any other region in Mexico. Well, that region in the UK is called Yorkshire. Now, within Yorkshire, we of course, because England is very big on class, right? We have got the working class bits of Yorkshire and we've got the middle class bits of Yorkshire. We are going to ignore the working class bits of Yorkshire, which of course is what the British are brilliant at doing. We're going to focus on North Yorkshire, which is very middle class. The English expression is it's for horse riding, for shooting birds and for fishing, which are all aristocratic hobbies. And so what you get is a very patrician, la-di-da, posh area of the country. And the first reaction to the policy from the government that there had to be a policy on AIDS was, good Lord, really? We don't have AIDS in here. That's the working class part of Yorkshire that's got AIDS. We don't have AIDS. We don't need a policy in this area. But the government was very persuasive. So they got together and they had meetings to decide what the policy was going to be. And what we then discovered was that in fact it involved 39 separate organizations and 19 different sources of funding. Now that, to put it mildly, is not an easy package of organizations. And what network governance is about is putting together those kinds of packages to deliver services, in this instance, just to one relatively small group. But that's what network governance means to me, creating packages of organizations that can deliver services. But this was a very bad example of it, because when they went looking in North Yorkshire for people with AIDS, they discovered they might have 39 organisations, but there wasn't even enough people with AIDS to go around. They could have needed, if they'd had 39 people with AIDS, they could have had one AIDS person per organisation, but they could only find 5 people who'd actually got AIDS for the whole of the county. So in fact, the North Yorkshire people were right. They didn't need a policy on AIDS, but they still had a network governance of 39 organisations to deliver the services. Now that was an example of where it went wrong. And one of the problems with network governance is when you put together all of these packages, you maximise the opportunities for things to go wrong. And my favourite story in this area is a very sad one. Now, the first story was slightly funny, flippant, jokey. The second story is just sad, and it concerns Alzheimer's. And there was an old lady who I will anonymise and call Mrs. K. And Mrs. K lived at home with her daughter and her grandchildren. And they'd worked out how to cope with her Alzheimer's, and they got some help from the doctor and from the health service. But the mother found it, the daughter found it very, very hard work, because she not only had a job, she got 2 young children and a mother with Alzheimer's. It was difficult. And there was a scheme run by the local government which gave carers at home the opportunity to go away on holiday. So they agreed that Mrs. K would go into a care home for 2 weeks whilst the daughter went away on holiday. And Mrs. K knew the care home because she used to go there for half a day a week. So that sounded like the perfect solution. So they took her into the care home, and almost within 24 hours, it had a disastrous outcome. Mrs. K was used to going home after half a day. When she wasn't allowed to go home after half a day because there was nobody at home, right, she became distressed. When a person with Alzheimer's becomes distressed, they become even more disoriented. And she became very disoriented. She tried to leave. When the nurses tried to restrain her from leaving, she got violent. I don't know whether you can see me on camera, but she started, and she hit a nurse. All right. And of course, the nurse was furious about being hit. And so they sedated her and they rang the daughter and said, "You've got to come home. She can't stay in the home. She's violent." So the daughter, who was also furious at this point, had to come home. So she came home and she got home, picked up her mother and took her back to the house. The trouble was Mrs. K was now really disoriented and did not recognize her own house. And so when they tried to take her into the house, she started waving the arms about again. And on this occasion, actually managed to punch her daughter in the face. The daughter was seriously not amused. Okay, so again, they had to call the doctor. Again, they had to sedate her. But having sedated her, they put her in her bed at home and then had to work out a care package for her. If she was going to stay at home, given that she was now more disoriented, how were they going to take care of her? And they put together a package. I won't go through all the organizations involved, but there were 17 of them. For example, because we had marketized public services, if you wanted a carer to stay at the house, one company would provide the carer for daytime and a separate company would provide the carer for nighttime. Right? Now, given that services get fragmented like that, you can see it's hard to put the package together. And the story from the daughter was that her house was like a railway station. There was always somebody coming. Even worse, because these are low-paid jobs, because they're not even really semi-skilled, the people who have them are not 100% reliable. So some days they just didn't turn up. And of course, that then created another nightmare. You can't leave a dementia person on their own in the house. Who knows what would happen? You know, they turn on the cooker to make a cup of tea and they burn the house down. I mean, you can't create that situation. So they turned to the university. And the university had a group of students who provided voluntary support in the community. And they were very good at providing, for example, babysitters for me. I had 2 young children at the time. And I strongly approved of the students helping me out when I wanted to take my wife out to dinner. But they weren't really trained to look after people with Alzheimer's. And they struggled when they were called in to help out. And when they were called in to help out, they got stressed. And one of them started raiding the drinks cabinet in the house and started drinking glasses of whiskey. When the daughter came home and found that the student smelt of alcohol, she was furious. You can't look after my mother if you have been drinking. And at this point, the woman who was in charge of the whole enterprise, and I am making no criticism of her whatsoever, she did the best that she could, but in a context where it was actually impossible to put together that many packages of that many organizations. There was always going to be a gap. There was always going to be a problem with doing it. And this is one of the perennial problems that the UK has created with network governance. We have split up public services into private companies to provide the service. In case you're unaware of Britain, 40% of our public services are now provided on contract by private companies. So I'm not talking about, a few contracts here, a few contracts there. I'm talking about a massive use of the private sector to deliver public services. Putting those packages together is now a perennial and continuing challenge for British government. Now, I've told you those stories to illustrate the problems, because as a result of those problems, we get the next wave of governance, which has got the horrible euphemism, it's not my preferred phrase, but everybody uses it, of meta governance. And this is the idea that what the central state's role nowadays is to help put together markets, bureaucracy, and networks so that they work. How do you ensure that the market delivery of services fits in with the networks, fits in with the bureaucracy? And the role of the centre is to steer all three ways of delivering services. And it's called meta-governance. And it's very popular amongst academics. When I mention this to my local government officers or to my national government officials, when I talk to them, they think I am completely and utterly mad and talking some strange gibberish from another planet, because it means nothing to them whatsoever. If I talk about steering, they have a better idea of what I'm talking about. But in steering's, how can I put it? Academics make their name by coming up with new concepts. So we invent these neologisms like meta-governance. And some professors in Europe will have been promoted to their full professorships on the back of developing this concept. And I'm not complaining. I got promoted to my full professorship because I developed the notion of network governance. I'd written on lots of other subjects, but that was the only one people knew me for. And so we are in the business of coining these expressions, and they get in the way. I don't think most people, certainly most practitioners, have got any idea what we're talking about when we talk about meta-governance. They've got some idea of what we're talking about when we talk about steering. And steering seems to me to be a big skill that central governments have got to manage, and it's different to issuing orders. Bureaucracies are really good at command and control. I mean, in Britain at the moment, because we're struggling with COVID-19, who do we bring in order to provide an efficient service delivery where there's no argument? And the answer is we bring in the military. Everybody agrees we've got to get people tested, that we've got to get people the vaccine. And the people who are really good at delivering on a command and control basis are the military. So we bring them in. When we had problems with sick cows, and we had to burn large numbers of them to stop the disease spreading, who did we bring in? We brought in the military. Command and control, in some circumstances, it works. If you want a quirky little story about it, imagine your house is burning down and you ring the fire service and the fire engine comes round. Now, what you expect in that context is somebody to give orders and make things happen. You'd be horrified if they all sat down and had a meeting to discuss how they were going to put the fire out. And in a nutshell, you've got the difference between a bureaucratic service delivery and a network service delivery. Network service delivery does not work in emergency situations. It can supplement and complement hierarchy, but it will not substitute for hierarchy. And so you've got the issue of putting these different systems together and making them work with one another. In Australia, for example, they have terrible problems with bushfires. One of the ways in which they manage bushfires is there's a central emergency committee, but it also works with and through local emergency committees which know what is going on in their specific area with the fire. In other words, they put together centralized bureaucratic command and control on the one hand with decentralized localized networks on the other. That's what meta-governance is about, getting these two things to work together. But again, there is a problem. Sometimes they don't work. No man should ever talk about women giving birth because we don't know anything about it and we're just a nuisance in the whole process. But we have midwives in this country whose job it is to go around helping women have their children, often at home. Women in Britain, the idea now is that they can choose between a home delivery and a hospital delivery. Now, the doctor will intervene if he thinks there is a genuine medical problem that the woman should have the delivery at home. But as far as is possible, given medical circumstances, women are allowed to have their babies at home. Now, it seems to me excellent that women should have the choice. But the hospital did not agree. The hospital thought that what it needed to do was see if it could, in fact, marketize this particular area and introduce contracts in order to provide the delivery of babies. And so it started asking for information such as how much does it cost to deliver a baby at home? Or the question which drove the midwives and the mothers to complete distraction, how long does it take to have a baby? Which is like asking how long is a piece of string? It takes as long as it takes. And they had no information about this. The problem was they asked the local doctors to provide this information and you got conflict. The midwives objected to the doctors providing this information to the bureaucratic hospital. The bureaucratic hospital ignored the midwives in this process, and ignoring midwives is a very bad idea. I don't know whether you've got midwives in Mexico, but in Britain, they are formidable women, all right? They work independently, they drive around in their own vehicles, they're delivering the service at home, they are used to making decisions for themselves without having to consult, you'll forgive the point, a mere man in this process. And so many doctors are in fact men. So when they were ignored, they were furious. And this was because it was fashionable to have performance review, to have contracts, to have management by results, etc., etc. And what you were doing, you took a little network of midwives, mothers, and local doctors who were making a very effective system of giving the women choice, and you bureaucratized it, and or at least you tried to bureaucratize it, you tried to marketize it, and it fell apart. It ended up with nobody speaking to anybody because everybody was cross with everybody else in the particular network. Now, it seems to me there you've got a number of things going on, the most important of which is nobody really understood the kinds of delivery systems they were working with. Some of them understood it was a bureaucracy. Some of them understood that it was local level, customized surface delivery, but nobody understood all the systems. And certainly nobody understood how to put all three together. And a key maxim here is it's the mix that matters. How do you mix bureaucracy, networks, and markets? And so many public services are a mix. And in fact, British government is very bad at meta-governance, or as I prefer to call it, managing the mix. We do not manage the mix well. Okay. Now, the end of that story, actually, first of all, it blows up into a mega argument because somebody leaks a document which says what the hospital really wanted was to stop the birthing at home and get everybody into hospital so we could have medicalized births. And the mothers, of course, were furious because this was taking away their choice. It also meant that the hospital could induce labor so that women delivered on a fairly standardized period of time. In other words, after 12 hours, you were induced, whether you wanted to be induced or not. Now, again, everybody was furious about that. And eventually the hospital just had to back off. It had to, it blew up a system that was working for 18 months in order to walk away because it was having such a disastrous effect. Now, those are the kinds of issues when you're trying to put together markets, hierarchies, and bureaucracies. And markets, hierarchies, and networks. And that's what we all have to do. All governments usually have to try and manage that particular mix. That's the arguments I used to get involved in. They're not the arguments I have nowadays. I decided that I got really upset with a number of colleagues because we were doing two things in the governance literature that I didn't like. First of all, we always talked about networks from the standpoint of the center. We always talked about the center managing a network. Why? Why does the center have to manage a network? Why can't it leave the network alone to manage itself? Was question number one. Question number two is, as an academic, why do I have to provide knowledge which is useful to managers who want to manage networks? Maybe what I want to do is provide knowledge to the network to help it resist the interventions from the center, which are often so unhelpful. And so I started to think, right, if I was going to do governance from a different standpoint, what would I do? And the answer is, instead of starting at the top, I'd start at the bottom. I'd look at how the network was actually working in the field, in practice, and take that as my starting point. I was prompted into this by another story. Oh, you unlucky people. In this particular case, we're talking about a children's playground. At the time, I was living in a city called Newcastle, which is in the northeast of England. And it's a rough, former shipbuilding, coal mining town. I mean, it's a great city. I absolutely love the place. But it had its hard side to it. And part of the problem for in the neighborhood where I lived is there was a children's playground and the public lighting there had failed. So it was dark and it had been taken over by people who were sleeping rough and by people who wanted somewhere quiet and private to inject with drugs where there wouldn't be any, e.g. police walking the streets. And so they used the playground. The local parents were cross that they'd lost their playground in this way. You know, they comment that we can't go there. There are empty beer bottles. There are needles from people injecting lying around on the floor, and there's no light. It's not safe. And then one of the parents had a bright idea of, why don't we actually clean it up? Why don't we go in there and, in effect, take it over? So they did. And a number of the things they did were actually, strictly speaking, illegal. So, for example, they got a ladder. They climbed the ladder and they put new light bulbs in the public street lighting. Now, you are not supposed to do that. Even worse, there's an English expression called, it fell off the back of a lorry, okay? Which actually means basically it was stolen. But, you know, it falls off the back of a lorry, it goes into a second-hand shop, and my mums and dads went in there and bought it. And it was cheap, so they could afford to. So off they go back to the playground and they light it. And so there's now lots of light in the playground. Then they get, at the weekend, they get all the dads out to go and clean it up. So they do the beer bottles, they do the syringes from the drug injection, they get all the rubbish out of the playground, and then they start to repair the swings and the roundabouts for the children to play on. And basically turn it from being a useless piece of spare ground into a little local playground for their children. And I thought it was a brilliant local initiative. It grew out of cooperation between parents. And then, unfortunately, the local authority found out. Now, the local authority, in the guise of the elected local politician, thought they had done a great job. You know, rounds of applause, well done, guys. I said, and I'll tell you what, in most of the public playgrounds, they have kind of a rubber coating that goes on the ground so that when the children fall off, they don't take all the skin off their elbows and their knees, okay? He said, I can get a grant from the local authority for you to put this down. And they thought, oh, well, that's not a bad idea. It would be good to protect the children from falling off the play things. And one of the blokes put his hand up and says, I know a man. That clearly means that's the phrase which introduces something that fell off the back of a lorry, who's actually got the paving stuff. And the local authority, and they should have known at this point, they should have known, the local authority said, no, it has to come from central supplies. That should have been the first warning bell in their heads, because now it meant they couldn't just improvise and make things work. They had to do things by the rules of the local authority. Now, the councillor, believing that he was doing good, believing he was really helping them, got them the grant, and then it took another 2 months for central supplies to identify the rubber paving and for the work people to come along and actually install it. Whilst they were doing this, the local authority, the parents got their first letter asking for a quarterly report on what was happening in the playground. And they discovered over the next year that they had to regularly submit reports to the local authority, including a financial report at the end of the year. And they hadn't signed up for any of that. They had signed up to take their children to the playground to play with them. They hadn't signed up to be free bureaucrats for the local authority. And slowly but surely, the parents drifted away from the playground. In effect, they had owned that playground. It was their playground. But once the local authority got involved, they no longer owned it. And when they didn't own it, they didn't want to play. Now, it seemed to me that that was a really good story about, if you want to understand governance, start at the bottom. Understand why people get involved. And let's face it, I mean, all of these people had jobs. They had houses to run, but they gave up free time to make this playground work. So if people are willing to do that kind of thing, how do you actually support them? And if you don't support them by providing local authority grants, is there another way of supporting people who are doing these kinds of good jobs? And that's the puzzle I wanted to think about. And what I came up with was, again, I'm fully aware that as an academic, I have to come up with ideas, with concepts which mark me as different from many of my other colleagues. So I came up with the idea of decentered governance. Now, at this point, you're all supposed to be really impressed that Rhodes has got a new concept. So my decentered notion of governance was that you start with the beliefs and practices of local agents. Now, I deliberately used local agents to cover both individual citizens on the one hand, but also, for example, if you know the expression, street level bureaucrats. These are the police officers, the care workers, anybody who is in face-to-face contact with the general public. And you ask them, what are you doing? My favorite question for research nowadays is just so simple, it's not true. And it is, how do things work around here? And my favorite research technique isn't surveys, it isn't massive quantitative things, it's actually doing qualitative case studies which seek to answer that particular question. And it's very effective at unearthing how things really do work at the local level. And what you look at is what people believe and what practices they've evolved at the local level. And decentered analysis has that focus. Now, obviously, agents operate in a context. They are not completely free to do whatever they want to do at the local level. So part 2 of the analysis has got to be, what is the context within which people work? And what are the constraints and what are the opportunities within that context? And I use the phrase situated agency. In other words, all agents are situated in a specific context. We can't just understand their beliefs and practices. We've also got to understand the context within which they work. In fact, it's just me using the language of political science to talk about what anthropologists do all the time. When the anthropologists go off to look at a tribe or a village or something, they don't just look at the people, they look at the traditions of that tribe, the traditions of that people. Well, I think we too can look at the traditions within our governmental systems. In Britain, you know, we have what I would consider to be a very damaging tradition of leaders know best. We've created this elite, which has run British government for centuries, and it has very, very few and poor contacts with localities. The contrast with France is very sharp. France has got a honeycomb system of contacts, from urban areas to regional areas to the National Assembly. That's politicians. They've also got the equivalent in the prefectural system on the administrative side. And there is these really strong links running all up and down their particular system. Britain doesn't. We've got a major disconnect. We've got local authorities which central government hates, and there's nothing in between. And we pay a price for it. It means our leaders are out of touch. I mean, I don't know whether you're familiar with British elections, but our right-wing Conservative Party just won a massive majority. It did so by appealing to voters like my Newcastle citizens. They lived in hard working areas, and the Labour Party, which is our socialist party, forgot about them. It was always after middle-class voters in the South. They don't win the election for you. You need them, but they won't win the election. And it was the Conservatives who remembered about the people in the North and the fact that they were disadvantaged compared to the rest of the country. Now then, if you're looking at things through the bottom up, you'd never miss that. I mean, my son went to university in a town called Liverpool. And if you ever come to Britain, allow me to advise you, never, ever go there. With full apologies to the translator, I don't know whether the expression shithole actually translates well into Mexican, into Spanish, but it is a complete shithole. I mean, you would never go there. It's basically a large chemical factory, and the industry has died there. And so when you wander around the streets, you see people aimlessly drifting about with nothing to do. You see people sat in the corners of shops drinking cheap cider, which is very potent and very cheap, and basically killing themselves on the stuff. No, I mean, nobody in their right mind to drink large quantities of it. I don't know whether you've got, again, there's the equivalent to drinking Mexico, which is both potent, dirt cheap, and lethal, but that's what this drink is. Drugs proliferate in this area, etc. As drugs proliferate, you've got to pay for the drugs. How do you pay for the drugs? Petty crime. And people steal things. It's got to the point where if you ring the police to report a burglary, what will happen is the police will make a note of the burglary. They will give you a report number for you to give to the insurance company. They will not investigate it. They don't even go round to see if you're telling the truth that something has been stolen. They're just not interested. They just don't investigate that kind of thing anymore. That's the extent of the deterioration in these communities. We have to, I think, adopt, if you want networks, we've got to understand how these communities work from the bottom up. The obvious place to start in Middlesbrough is with the voluntary organisations, with the NGOs. The NGOs are the ones who are out there in the streets trying to confront the problem. And if you want to develop services for that area, I think you have to develop the services, if not through the NGOs, then certainly with the NGOs. And what I'm drawing attention to with these little stories is the notion of local knowledge. That, I mean, the centre knows what the centre knows, okay? And it thinks it knows about international relations. It thinks it knows about the European Union. It thinks it knows about President Biden, etc., etc. It doesn't know about Middlesbrough. People who live in Middlesbrough know about Middlesbrough, so ask them. See if you can actually get decent, useful information out of them, and we don't do it. And it's always, as you can see, I can get excited about it. I don't understand when there is an obvious source of information why we don't tap into it. Now, I gather most of you are involved in urban planning, etc., and metropolitan areas, in which case you will know that in the planning literature, there is actually a tradition of this kind of local level activism. I remember reading a very good book entitled Guerrillas in the Bureaucracy, which was about planning officials who were sent out to work with local communities to help them to develop local plans, who then went back to the local authority, or the urban authority as it was, and provided the local information in devising the plans, to suddenly discover that they were considered troublemakers. That by providing local level information about what local people want, it didn't meet what the elites wanted in the urban area. And you had a disconnect. They were talking past one another. Nobody was talking to one another in this context. Now, those are the kinds of issues I think we need to confront. They're more important than some of the la-di-da issues of it's the mix that matters, right? The mix might matter, but what matters even more is actually knowing what is happening on the ground. And I don't know about Mexico, but I suspect it's no different to the UK. Your top politicians, your top officials do not know what is happening on the ground, although only the sketchiest idea, because quite frankly, they don't want to go to those kinds of areas. They probably think they're unsafe. They probably think they're unwelcome. And certainly in the UK, they might be safe. They're certainly unwelcome. And they get, hostile receptions, and people shout at them and they throw tomatoes and so on and so forth. So they need to get to grips with looking at the voices of the silent, the people whose voice is never heard in the decision-making systems. We need to tap into them in some way. I think the decentered approach does it. And I think there's a method for doing it as well, which is called collecting stories. And one of the reasons I tell the stories in the course of the lecture is to make the point that storytelling, yes, it might be a more entertaining way of talking to people, but it's actually a serious activity. We spend a lot of our lives telling each other stories as a way of communicating information. Sometimes the stories are unreliable, in which case we call it gossip. And I'm sure the Mexicans love gossiping as much as the English love gossiping, okay? But it's a form of storytelling. But storytelling is also serious. Again, an example, this time from Australia, just to show I can talk about things other than England. It concerns farmers in Western Australia. The Western Australian state government provided a series of grants to farmers for various things. How to improve soil quality, how to improve yields of milk from cows, etc., etc. And they had about 8 or 9 of them. And they didn't really know which one worked. And they didn't want to take the time and trouble of setting up a survey and getting a systematic sample and all of that palaver. They had field agents, who were public servants in the field. And they said to them, collect the best story that you've got, i.e. which subsidy was really successful and the farmers loved, and collect the worst story, i.e. which subsidy the farmers thought was a complete waste of time. So they collected the stories and middle-level managers sifted them. And they took out the good stories. And they passed the good slowly but surely, went up the hierarchy until at the very top, they'd got a list of the successful stories. And they discovered that 2 or 3 of the subsidies really, really worked. And they decided, actually, we know it's not scientific in the sort of naturalist, positivist sense, right? But this is good, hard information. These people know that their cows have a higher yield of milk as a result of this particular subsidy. So why don't we give them more of this subsidy and make sure that more farmers take up this subsidy and drop off? They had one on fertilizers for soil, which nobody wanted. Nobody was interested in it. Nobody used it. And let's drop that particular subsidy. And they did. The whole exercise took about 4 months to get the information in. It went all the way to the top. It got into the budgetary system. All that had to happen was somebody had to A, ask about the stories, and then B, systematically collate them to pass them up the hierarchy. It was not a big ask. They managed to do it. And so I think, that one of the ways we can deal with this is there are simple techniques. I mean, there's a friend of mine at the University of Bath who does storytelling in organizations. He uses a questionnaire and he asks my kind of dumb question of how do things work around here? So he will ask them, what story did you tell your wife when you went home from work last night? And sometimes it pays to actually phrase that slightly differently. What story did you not tell your wife when you went home from work? Because it would just distress you again. sometimes when you go home to tell, and you want to, it's been an absolutely awful day, you're really not happy about the way things went, and you just want to forget about it. You don't want to have to tell the story again. You're sick of it. You want a glass of beer, a glass of wine, a decent meal, and to put your feet up and watch the television. Okay, well, maybe you should ask about the story that didn't get told. And that's what he does. And he asks, it's quite a simple questionnaire, and it works wonders in terms of getting people to tell stories. They work really well if you use it in conjunction with focus groups. If you get everybody from the same organization, so there's a shared history of stories that they don't know all the stories, but they share very many stories, and put them in a room. If a good focus group will soon have people saying, oh no, that's a load of nonsense, that one. What really happened was. And you can actually refine your stories in the focus groups. And it's a basis for acting. Now, I am conscious, certainly with my senior British public servants, that they think this is another exercise in academic whimsy. Another bloody academic who thinks he's got a good idea, who just talks and talks and talks. It's of no practical use whatsoever. Well, maybe. I do know that there are in the United States of America firms that specialize in doing really rapid ethnographic field trips on which they collect stories. And instead of sending one person into an organization for a year, they send 12 people in for a couple of weeks. Then they come out and then they provide that advice to the managers and say, this is what people are concerned about. This is what people say. This is what they're talking, and so on and so forth. Now then, Americans do not throw hard dollars at something which is useless. I mean, most Americans know the value of a book. And the reason these companies are growing is because it's a service that they can sell, and it's a service which industries will buy. So it is not just academic whimsy. People are actually using this kind of ethnographic fieldwork to deliver data for information for decision makers. But that then bumps me up, and I'll stop in just a moment, about my second problem with the governance literature. I'm back doing instrumental knowledge again. And why am I doing that? Why do we always end up trying to provide information for decision makers? And so I tried to turn that on its head and say, let's actually provide information for local people. So for example, if they don't like a policy, why don't we tell the government how much they hate it? Why don't we actually let people who are actually silent and are never listened to normally actually have a decent voice about it? Now, that is fantastically unpopular. I have to say, managers don't want to listen to criticism. I don't know what your Mexican officials are like when it comes to being told they're doing a bad job, but I suspect they don't like it, because they certainly don't like it in the UK. And it's really hard to pass bad information up the hierarchy. People don't want to listen. But that's not a reason for us to stop unearthing the bad information and try to make it clear that this is actually a bad policy which people are not responding to. Now, this is clearly, I'm in danger here. I'm in danger of actually saying that local knowledge and stories are in some way always, in inverted commas, true. And of course, they're not. People, we know full well from our politicians, and I'm sure that Mexican politicians are just like UK politicians. They tell lies, right? They tell out and out lies about what they're doing and why they're doing things, because it's in the nature of the beast. Okay, so we've got to look upon stories with suspicion. We can't just take them as proven facts, etc., etc. And the only way I can think we do that is we actually have to be a bit like lawyers in a courtroom. We have to forensically interrogate stories. How do you know this? What facts have you got to substantiate this? What's the counter argument, etc., which is what would happen in a courtroom. We have to forensically interrogate stories. Theoretically, that's what the UK civil servants are supposed to be good at. So let's get them doing what they're good at and forensically interrogating stories, and let's use our academic time and efforts to actually provide them with stories from the grassroots about what we think is happening. Now, that said, one of the problems with local knowledge is there is no such single thing as local knowledge. If you took a town, for example, there's no one local knowledge in that town. There are different neighborhoods. I mean, the simplest distinction is between landowning middle-class neighborhoods on the one hand and poor subsistence based on the other. They will tell different stories. They'll have different local knowledge, etc., etc. The task is to actually identify the variety of stories and see which ones you can respond to and which ones you cannot. I don't wish to sound a depressing note, but certainly for British politicians, we have never managed to solve the problem of poverty ever since we decided it was a problem back in the 19th century. I mean, the poor are always with us, etc., etc. So I'm a great believer in breaking up problems into bite-sized pieces. So give the politicians information from localities which are bite-sized, which they can actually do something about. We had one Minister of Finance a decade or so ago who decided he wasn't going to even bother with inequality as such, right? He was going to do something about children under 5. That was it. He was going to target the whole thing on children under 5. It was, he said, unacceptable that there's a child under 5 going hungry in this country. We're in the world top 10 as a rich country. That is unacceptable. That's the kind of targeting I think is a good idea. And what local knowledge can do is help us to identify the targets. And help us to identify the bits of problems we can actually do something about. So local knowledge is contested. It varies from locality to locality, and it is not amenable to central direction and control. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not claiming that local knowledge is a panacea, but I do think it's an essential supplement to the way we are making policies at the moment. And I also think in terms of the legitimacy of our respective political systems, if we involve people and they feel that they have a voice in what is happening, then that political system is therefore that bit more legitimate than if they're ignored. All right. So that's my sort of central argument for you today, that we need to move on from the old style of governance in the 1990s. We need to move on to notions of decentered governance, where we pay attention to local beliefs and practices, and where local knowledge is weighed in the balance when we're devising our particular policies. Thank you. Now, this is why I hate Zoom. Because normally if I go to an audience, first of all, I don't think I've sat still for this long in 10 years. But secondly, when I finish, I get a round of applause and there's nobody there. No. I wasn't trying to milk it. It's one of the thing. It's just not the same when you haven't got a real live audience.
Thank you, Professor Rhodes. We are thankful for these rich and illustrative reflections gently shared with us. Your keynote lecture has been a great delight. I shall pass voice to Dr. Carlos Navarrete, and then we'll proceed to introduce our moderators in just a second. Please, Dr. Carlos Navarrete.
Oh, muchas gracias, Álvaro. Realmente no, el diálogo, Marco y Juan Ángel de Meruti se iniciarán el diálogo, pero no quería dejar yo pasar la oportunidad de expresar que esta ha sido una experiencia fantástica. Hemos leído mucho al profesor Rhodes, pero escucharlo y ver su rostro y sus expresiones, escuchar sus narrativas, sus historias, ha sido realmente una experiencia fantástica. Y justo da cuenta de la importancia de la sensibilización que genera la conexión, el contacto, y más cuando haya densidad, ¿no?, de relaciones, que sería lo que le da forma a las redes. Desde luego que, por ejemplo, veía que Alejandro Lieberman, que es un amigo de Argentina, comentaba algo sobre la relación entre las cuestiones jurídicas, ¿no?, el armado de las instituciones de manera formal, cómo conectaba esta cuestión con, yo diría, cómo conecta lo informal con lo formal, cómo conectar el asunto de la parte informal de las redes, en qué grado crearles un marco institucional, un marco jurídico, en qué grado el gobierno debe darles de darles orientación, sentido, organizarlas, gobernarlas, dice Alejandro. ¿Quién gobierna las redes? Yo más bien diría, es el gran reto, el gran reto de estudiar el tema de gobernanza y aplicarlo a una agenda urbana, queda en evidencia cuando incorporamos como parte central la idea de las narraciones y el de contar historias, porque esto implica una conexión con una gran cantidad de actores, ¿no? Implica sumar actores, e implica que múltiples voces se expresen, de tal manera que probablemente también en eso sea insuficiente el gobierno tradicional, el gobierno jerárquico, vertical. Es decir, probablemente ellos mismos se asumen insuficientes para poder acercarse a la gente y escuchar muchas voces. Entonces, los retos tendrán que venir de abajo hacia arriba. Y otra cuestión que también hay de esa duda de Alejandro surge es nuestra relación como investigadores, como científicos, con esas comunidades y cómo nosotros contribuir a la generación de políticas públicas, acercándonos a escuchar y a dar voz a esas comunidades. Muchas gracias. Álvaro, adelante con el conversatorio.
Excuse me, is Marisol supposed to be translating for me?
No, but we can do a quick summary about what Carlos was talking about. It basically, I agree with him that it was such an entertaining presentation, but also a very educational one. We've learned in a very fun way about your stories, about your narratives, and it's a great way to understand these issues on networking. He was talking about what's going on right now in our societies. How can we connect the government with these networks? And I think an interesting question is to know if in Latin America in general or in Mexico in particular, we are at that stage. We wonder if we are still in a very vertical, hierarchical bureaucracy, and whether we have really changed to that mix. I think we're far away from that. And well, this multi-level tiers that we can find in society or in government also pose a very complicated and challenging scenario. How can we connect these neighborhood level discussions with local, with subnational and national, and so even supranational stuff that is going on? So that's a question I would like to pose to Rode. And well, very happy to finally listen from your own voice what we have read for some time. And well, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Can I comment on what you just said?
Sure.
Then I have a PhD student who's working in China. And she's doing network governance, and China is probably better than most countries at being hierarchical and bureaucratic and indeed violent. And what she found was if you got down to local service delivery, and if you looked at the role of NGOs, there were quite clear local delivery networks in the areas of caring for the elderly, and in children who had got mental and physical handicaps. And the only way the state got involved was usually by funding the NGOs. So the state itself did not have face-to-face contact with the citizen over the services. It used the NGOs as the front for it, and they seem to work. So, I mean, I don't know about the Latin American experience, but maybe the question is, if you look at it from the top, it seems a very hierarchical and bureaucratic system. But what would it look like if you looked at it from the bottom, and if you looked at it from the standpoint of an NGO and the individual workers within NGOs who are out there talking to specific clients? And maybe they've got at that local level a network. Because let's face it, China's hierarchical.
Yeah, yes. Right, that might be a switch of approach
Yes.
in
the
the way we do things.
Yeah. But it's not just a switch of approach for how governments do things, it's a switch of approach for how academics do things.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the glamour and the prestige is if you write the big book about Mexican or Brazilian or Argentinian government, right? Grubbing around in a local neighborhood, looking at childcare or age of, it's just not sexy. Right? You're not, it is quite possible the promotions committee will look at that and think, that's not very interesting. It might not be interesting to the promotions committee, but it really is important. And maybe it's not just a question of governments need to think about the local level, but maybe we academics need to think about it. And I'm talking about myself here. I mean, I'm not being immodest when I say, you know, my largest book of recent years was entirely a study of central elites. And people noticed it because more people are interested in central elites than they are in my Newcastle playground. Nobody outside of Newcastle cares about the Newcastle playground, whereas most people think they are interested in central elites. And that's part of the problem. I mean, one of my colleagues did brilliant work on, we've got a little island near here called the Isle of Wight, which is, frankly, it's la-di-da. I mean, they sail yachts. And they sail local yachts and ocean-going yachts, etc., and it's deemed to be a rich area. And he actually went in there to do a study to find local poverty, and he found it. And he found it, and it's fascinating as to why there was local poverty. Local poverty happened if people depended upon public transport. Because if you were poor, you couldn't involve a car. The best you could do was a bicycle. If there wasn't public transport, you couldn't travel for work. You had to use the local shop, which was much more expensive than the big supermarket, but you had to get a bus to go to the big supermarket, and there was only a bus at 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock at night. And poverty was hinged to the availability and access to public transport. Now, I think that's a really significant finding. And if somebody was interested in dealing with poverty on the Isle of Wight, they should start not with income support programs, etc. Give them public transport. Let them travel to work. You know, let them travel to the supermarket, etc. It's because you imprison them in these estates, and it's hard to get out of them, that you get these pools of poverty. Now, that's what I mean when a bottom-up perspective. With, again, I'm being instrumental again, and it so irritates me. But I mean, there is a clear policy solution there, which is subsidize public transport to go there, say 6 times a day. Not exactly an hourly service, but nonetheless, massively improving what's available at the moment. I'm talking too much, sorry.
No.
Well, thank you very much for your fascinating talk, Professor Rhodes. I kind of made a sketch, an informal sketch of your key points that I would like to point out. You tell us to follow our great recommendation, which is start at the bottom. And that gives us a sense of all these methods that are not new, but we usually forget them in our scholar work or even at the public organization level. And then I love your research question, which is how do things work around here? You know, to give us this first opportunity to kind of sense the environment of the organization or the public problem that we want to approach. Then you talked a lot about context, local knowledge, which is not a panacea, which I totally agree. And this is a very frequent discussion among scholars here in Latin America. There's a gap between the top-down and up approaches in the seminars or at the scholar environment at the Ivory Tower. And it seems that we don't have these communication feedback loops to get along with. So I think with your approach, we can hopefully narrow that gap. But of course, we have to point out from the first moment the challenges, like that it has to be both-sided. It's not a single thing. We have to identify targets. It's a contesting issue, and it's not going to be easy, of course. But I also like the part of the silent voices that are around, that usually you don't include them in a formal analysis of policy making, for example. And if you do it in the hope that it is done properly, you can communicate it well to the middle managers at the public organizations, and then finally reach the top-down approach. But of course, that is very, very complex in reality, but it's a good, we always have to try to do it. So my question in this regard is, how do we have to change at the universities and the campus and the social sciences programs, especially in public policy in different schools? Here in Mexico, we don't have many, but we are growing fast, very fast. So which methods, which skills do we have to rethink about in order to complement this policy mix or policy tool approach that is taught traditionally? So which other skills have to be fostered to graduate students or undergraduate students in order to approach this? I mean, not everybody has the ethnography background like an anthropologist, but how can we approach these mixed methods in an effective way and do a critical mass to influence the policy decisions in our context?
Sure. One of my problems is the word ethnography, which in most people's minds instantly connects as being anthropology, and it involves living somewhere away from home for at least a year. And I think that is a serious misconception about ethnography. Let me use a different word. Let me talk about observation, and let me talk about field work, and throw out all the stuff about anthropology, etc., etc. And I think observation and field work are things we can, for example, get our master's degree students to do in their dissertations. Even here, I have a story. I had a master's degree student who wanted to do a dissertation on the police. As it happened, her father was a police sergeant. And when she asked him, he said no. So I had a chat with him and said, why don't you tell him to ask one of his friends in another police area so that you're not doing it in his area? So he did, and she got in. And she spent about 6 weeks and did a dozen interviews and walked on the beat with a couple of police constables. And the question was, how much discretion does the police officer have when they're out on the streets? Because we'd had new laws which were supposed to reduce their discretion. And first of all, she absolutely loved it because she'd never been out in the field before. She'd never got to talk to real live people before. All she talked to was to students and to academics. And we all know they're not real live people. And so her enthusiasm for it just grew as she did it. And she came up with a really good little thesis in which she concluded that when the law was first introduced, their discretion was reduced. But as everybody lost interest in the policy, and as it just became part of the back cloth to which they worked, their discretion about what they did on the streets grew and grew and grew. And the only change of significance was that they now had to report more of that than they used to. Okay, but nothing more. Now, I think that's devising those kinds of mini projects for our master's degree students, or you could even for your best undergraduates, in the third year, if they have to do a little dissertation, right, they can do observation and they can go into the field and they can do interviews. They don't have to sit in the library, and they don't have to rely on surveys. And I just think, well, I'm sorry, this is going to sound rude, and I don't want to be rude, but do you know Big Bang Theory? Right, and so you know Sheldon.
Yeah, pretty much.
I think too many of us are like Sheldon. They were absolutely terrified of going out into the real world and playing there. And I think we need to, you, me, our students need to go out and actually talk to people about what is happening in their lives and in their local services, because there's real information there. And again, the phrase I use when I'm talking, this is supplementary information to the other information that government has got. But at the moment, it doesn't even have it as supplementary information. Now, I think observation, field work, and interviews are something everybody can get experience of at undergraduate, master's degree, and certainly at PhD level. I mean, PhDs could possibly go away for a year. I mean, there must be remote areas of Mexico, which the capital city completely ignores, and sort of lives like a little, it's almost a country within a country. That'd be a brilliant place to go and do ethnography. So, I mean, you've got to tailor it to the students and the times they've got available. The key thing is getting out of the library, getting out of our rooms, and going and asking people my dumb question of how do things work around here. And I think we can all do that. And moreover, it's one of those skills which, yes, I mean, I do courses on it for my students, and I tell them stories, and they think they know what it will be like, but they don't. But once they've done it for a few weeks, they get a real sense of what it's like to be out there, and the good ones adjust really fast because you've got to be quick on your feet. I mean, one of my basic rules I tell them time after time is forget about the research question that your dissertation committee has approved, right? When you're in the field, go where you are led. And if it doesn't address your research question, who cares? Maybe it'll be more interesting, right, to go where this person is suggesting you should go. And unless you go there, you'll never find out. So you go where you, and the other one I give them all the time is take what you are given. Because too often, we resist information that doesn't fit with the way we think the world is. So you take what you're given. If somebody says, this is important, you might not believe them, but you still go and find out. Okay? Sure. And that openness is a quality which is, well, once you start doing it, you just get better and better and better at it. And like everybody, I'm not claiming I'm any different, we get tunnel vision. We get into set ways of thinking about the world. And going into the field is one of the ways we can actually disrupt our tunnels.
Sure. My students will love that interpretation, but the only precondition is that they should study very well the hardcore methods and then go to the fields, because sometimes they skip that phase and go directly, and that would not work.
Yeah, I can't speak for Mexican universities or any Latin American university. I can't speak for British universities. Qualitative methods, fieldwork, observation, a teeny weeny little fraction of the methods course, and it's ridiculous. I think qualitative methods are as important as quantitative, and that the methodological arguments with ethnography are as important as the methodological arguments with the quant side. I mean, I've been a professor for God knows how long, far too long to ever admit to in public, and I have taught these methods courses all the way through. Okay, and we've just got, it's not that anybody's right or anybody's wrong. The only thing we've got wrong is the balance. We need to get both methods into the curriculum. And one of the reasons for actually doing my methods is, I'm sorry guys, they're actually a lot more interesting than quantitative. And I don't know what your students are like with your methods courses, but my students hate them. I mean, they just think they're dead boring. And so if you can lead off with qualitative methods and fieldwork stories, at least you get their interest on day one. I also think, to be perfectly honest, it's a really, because this is what I was lucky. It happened to me as an undergraduate. I had a professor who actually sent me out interviewing in his constituency because he was a local politician. So it's called canvassing. So I canvassed for him. And then when he did survey work, he sent me out to do, to interview people on their doorsteps. Now, nowadays, we so often don't even do the interviewing ourselves. We employ a survey organization to go out and do it for us. Now, that's Sheldon all over, that is. Why go out and talk to people if you can get somebody else to do it for you? No, go and talk to them. It's different when you do it on the doorstep. It's not the same as just getting the printout.
Well, there are some questions from the attendees. I think we should go ahead with them. Alejandro Lieberman from Argentina, he says that many of the public problems occur because the channels are not clear, or there are no channels for citizens to participate in the solution. So what are the appropriate channels to create good governance together with social actors?
Well, I agree with the starting proposition. I mean, I don't know what the best channels would be for Argentina. I'm sorry. I just don't know the political system well enough. I do know that there are two groups of actors who can often be influential. There are the NGOs, and assuming you've got local level NGOs, they can actually make a difference at the local level. And the other ones are not senior bureaucrats, but street level bureaucrats. Street level bureaucrats who have to actually deal with citizens on a day-to-day basis can also make a difference. So again, if you want to, a silly example, but I love it. The police have got canteens where they go for lunch. Because it costs money to provide the food in the canteens, they started to close them down. It was a really stupid thing to do. What happens in canteens other than people having a meal? And the answer is they tell one another about the problems they're having on the streets and how they dealt with them. So I suggest that for e.g. Social care workers at the ground level, that whoever employs them, whether it's the NGO or local authority, they actually have a canteen where they can go and have meals and share stories about what they're doing, what the problems are, and how best to resolve them. And I think the kinds of solutions we should look for are those kinds of silly solutions. It sounds so silly, but in the police, it actually, in the traditional literature, led to what was called canteen culture. Now, people criticize that because historically it got associated with racism and sexism. Okay, but that's not necessarily what will happen in canteen culture. Canteen culture is the experience of these workers on the streets. If you're going to learn from one another's experience, there has to be a place to meet. There has to be a mechanism for doing it. Now, any local authority can have a canteen for its workers to meet. And then what you can do is what I would actually call, you can employ somebody I would call a facilitator, who goes in there and encourages people to share their experiences. And again, nowadays we live in a world of, do you have evidence-based policymaking? Has that been inflicted on you?
Yes, sure.
Terribly sorry. That shouldn't happen to anybody. I'm a great believer in experiential knowledge. That people who've done a job for 20 years have got things to teach you. So bloody well ask them, but we don't. So I would actually be, canteen culture is about forums for sharing experiential knowledge, and we should do that. And again, another stupid thing, I don't know what you do on your courses. If I was doing a course in a public policy area, I would get a street level bureaucrat in to talk to my students. I would get a police officer in. In fact, some of my best sessions have been with police officers who can be phenomenally indiscreet when you get them in and tell you the kind of stories that make your blood curdle. But then if you ask the right questions of them, you can learn why they're reacting this way to it. Why they think senior managers in police organizations are only interested in reform if it leads to their promotion within the organization. If most street level coppers believe that. Mm-hmm. So they think most reform within their organization is nonsense. It's not real in the sense of making policing better. It's only real in the sense of getting middle level managers promoted. Now you've got to tackle that. You know, if you want to improve your police organizations, you've got to tackle that kind of cynicism. I mean, I sympathize, I understand, but equally, if I wanted to aim at reforming a police organization, I would be saying, how can we use experiential knowledge? I certainly wouldn't be using evidence-based policymaking.
Well, I have another question for you, Professor. It's more epistemic. I mean, it seems like these traditions have also a very, voice in the American inquiry and research schools. I'm thinking about the work of Ostrom or Douglas North in the neo-institutionalism, or maybe the advocacy coalition framework from Sabatier with these values.
Yes. Hi,
So, that's exactly my point. Do you find these communications channels at the scholar level between both schools with your approach, or it's still work in process, or it's completely isolated?
I mean, I am not persuaded by the rational choice people, because their assumptions that people act on the basis of self-interest is not an assumption I wish to start with. I think people act for a multitude of reasons, and I want to understand the variety of reasons that underpin them, which is why I talk about the beliefs and practices of individual actors. So I'm unsympathetic to that. I'm also pretty unsympathetic to the kind of formalization that you get in Sabatier's work. But equally, I mean, I've read Paul's stuff on interpretive approaches, and he's scathingly critical of the interpretive stuff. My stance in all of this is let 1,000 flowers bloom. I don't think anybody knows which approach is the best approach in the social sciences. What I do know is that every approach usually throws up an outstanding practitioner who writes good articles and good books. And that's what we're interested in, because we can all learn, irrespective of the tradition, from good authors writing good books. As I say, I don't like rational choice theory very much. I think Eleanor Ostrom was a gifted academic. And when I knew Eleanor, and when Eleanor spoke, I listened. And I think that should be our attitude towards any and all traditions. I mean, if you want me to be controversial, I may draw the line at creationists, all right? Do you have creationists in Mexico? No.
There are a few.
All right. All right. I wondered if it was a joke that didn't travel.
Just joking. Yeah.
Well, there are some students in town planning. How would you connect these ethnography studies or this observation? Well, let's forget about ethnography, observation and field work to the town planning processes and plans. Have you got any experience connecting these two different disciplines?
Yes, it's such a long time since I did anything on urban planning, etc., etc. But when I did do it, there were a whole group of people. Forrester is a name that springs to mind as somebody who was very into locally based planning. And I can't remember the authors of the book entitled Gorillas in the Bureaucracy, but that was another one. And was it Alvarez wrote the book on civic action in urban areas? I mean, there's a whole, planning is one of the fields which had a lot of people who in the 70s and 80s were really interested in this. But I imagine, like all of these things, it's a fashion that has now, it's now part of the history of the discipline. Well, maybe what I'm saying is it's time to go back and revisit J. Forrester, I think the name was, and see what relevance his work would have today. Because again, I mean, academia, I'm a great fan of rock music. And when the besetting sin of rock music is fashion, something's in for 3 to 5 years and then it's gone. And there are times when I think academia is a bit like that. Something's in for probably a decade, but then it's gone. And I think we could look back within the planning literature to some of the other people who are talking about participation. And let's not do Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation again, but let's look at some of the studies which were about local planning practices. And certainly a lot of, for in metropolitan areas, they had big metropolitan plans that covered the whole of the travel to work area. But then within that, there were local plans. And the local plans are clearly the point at which you would involve as many citizens as possible, and where you would use my kinds of fieldwork studies to get out there and find the information which would be useful to your local plan.
There's a comment from Francisco Porras. He's also very thankful for your thought-provoking lecture. And he's saying that another way to look at the relations between network governance and interpretive policy making is recovering your argument of the three ways of governance, which you just explained in your presentation today. You're part of the first and of the third ways, he says. By the way, we have jokingly referred to this as the tensions between the first and second roads. Yes.
I cope with my stresses and strains.
And
where would we be without our contradictions?
Right, right. Well, and he also pinpoints one of your key elements in your presentation about mixing this hierarchical bureaucracy and the network part of the network parting of the policy making. So I wonder if you would like to elaborate on that.
Sure. I mean, I think the people who've done the best work on this are, he says, desperately looking for the book, it's Jacob Torfing and his colleagues at the University of Roskilde in Denmark. I thought wrote quite a good book on, it should be on my shelves, but I can't see it. Where are you, Jacob? Interactive governance. Interactive governance, it was called. And I thought that was, if you are working within the governance paradigm, okay, I thought that was a very sensible way of taking the kinds of things I was arguing in the 90s forward. I cite it quite regularly. My interests are not really in that area at the moment, but I was impressed with that book. And the other one, which is actually rather good, especially, I mean, I don't know, am I talking to a colleague or a student? I don't know. But if it's a colleague, forgive me. If it's a student, Chris Ansell and Jacob Torfing did a really good Handbook of Governance. I challenge anybody to read it from beginning to end without snoring. But it's still very thorough.
He's actually a colleague. His name is Francisco Porras. You know Francisco Porras.
In which case, my apologies, Francisco. I was not meaning to offer any insult. I was just trying to be helpful.
Okay.
You probably got your own autographed copy from Jacob.
We have another question from Luis Alvarez. It says, in the case of Chile, there was a very clear policy in the 1990s to incorporate NGOs into public social policies, but the result was a subordination of work and social networks to public policy. How can we maintain the independence of or freedom of the networks? How do we promote the creativity of the network from the point of view of public policy?
Sure. Excellent question. I endorse your sentiments 100%. I think the only way, I think when governments get directly involved with NGOs and with local level networks, it's a dead hand on them. Usually it ends within a couple of years, it usually ends up killing them because everybody loses the will to live under the dead hand of bureaucracy. But there are ways of doing it, I would have thought, which did not involve hands-on measures by the centre. Given the American system is, I know, very fragmented compared to many other systems, but one of the notions there is the notion of facilitative leadership, where somebody's job is to bring people together to help them to work together, and they do that, not the state government or the federal government. Now, those kinds of facilitative leaders do seem to me a way of actually giving the the central state some notion of what is happening on the local level and providing some assistance to NGOs without actually severely constraining them. But it is a problem. Central governments the world over are so reluctant to leave these systems alone and let them get on with it. And some of them will get it wrong, and some of them will make mistakes, and some of them will be a disaster, but more of them will actually work. And you just have to grit your teeth and let the ones that fail, fail, and let the ones that succeed, succeed, and stay out. Because the moment you get involved, all of them will fail. Networks and bureaucracy do not mix. It's oil and water. And the question is, does the centre have the courage to stay out, or at least to use only very distant hands-off measures? And facilitative leadership might be a possible hands-off measure in this context. But I do sympathise. It's a genuine problem. It's the same, my little playground story in Newcastle. That illustrated that ownership is so important. People must be allowed to own their own networks.
And
I don't go a bomb on the expression "that was quite interesting."
No, yes, of course. But speaking of that, what would you think would be the differences in collaborating with bureaucracies with more or less autonomy, for instance? That's a question from Jimenez.
So say that again.
What are the differences in collaborating with bureaucracies with more or less autonomy?
Oh, I think collaborating with bureaucracies is always a problem. I mean, the trouble with bureaucracies is, I mean, it's quite right that they are hierarchies. That's what they're there for. I mean, the idea that that the military was a network just fills me with horror. I mean, you know, it is meant to have a unified ethos. It is meant to have command and control from top to bottom. Fair enough. It's fit for purpose. The point is, bureaucracies are used in areas where they are not fit for purpose. So the issue for me is to identify the areas where they are essential. And that is usually, you know, emergency services, defense, trying to think of other ones. Well, police would count as emergency services, wouldn't they? But even in the police, you see, the interesting question there is, how do you get neighborhood policing in the context of a hierarchy? And it's a real problem. And have I got time for another story?
Sure, please.
This is a housing estate in Canberra, and the local police force were being very good. I mean, I applaud. They put an officer on this problem estate, and his role was to build links with the local community, and he was very good at it. He didn't wear his uniform. He helped with all kinds of grubby things going on the estate. He didn't try to be above the things around him. He just took part in everything, etc. And very rapidly, the local inhabitants started to trust him, and they brought their problems to him, and he didn't sort of try to take them in and put them in cells and arrest them. He tried to help them solve their problems as best he could. And after about a year and a half, the estate was a lot less trouble than it had been. Obviously, he wasn't the instant solution to everything, but he made a difference to what was going on there. And then, obviously, the police commissioner in the area knew that this guy had done this really good job, and Australia had got a problem in one of the Pacific Islands. And at 24 hours notice, they pulled him off the housing estate and sent him to the Pacific Island because they thought his diplomatic skills would be really useful there, which indeed probably was a perfectly rational thing for them to say. The trouble was the people on the housing estate felt appallingly let down. You know, the hierarchy had its priorities, so it took him off the job, but the local people had their priorities and their hopes were dashed. And that's the problem. Voluntary network type activity mixes really uncomfortably with bureaucracy. And you have to know the limits to bureaucracy. So my argument about bureaucracy all the time is, what is it good for? And just use it for that.
Thank you, Professor. We have a couple more questions to maybe to wrap up a little bit. One is if you can elaborate a little bit more on the informal rules, especially in the meta-governance and decentralized governance context. I mean, we understand that they play a key role, but we also understand that other authors use them a lot, maybe in a different, slightly different sense. So we would like to know your thoughts on that.
Well, here I draw on Jacob Torfing's work, and it seems to me rules can help in meta-governance if they're cast sufficiently broadly. It's like you use rules to mark out the area where people work, but you don't use them to cover their behavior within that area. They mark out the territory, but they don't govern behavior within the territory. Or if you prefer, it's a map where you've got a signpost pointing in the right direction, but there's no local roads on the map. Right? There's just the general direction in which you go. And I sympathize with that notion. That seems to me to be sensible in those areas where you can use it. The other notion that I am sympathetic to, again, Jacob argues it, is that what the elite do is provide the unifying narrative for a policy area. And nowadays, we're getting very used to the notion of politicians having the narrative for their administration. And I think it's the abuse of that which is unfortunate. I mean, we had a prime minister here who talked about the big society. And it was just so unclear what it was supposed to be. And what he ended up doing was discrediting some really quite good ideas within that because it wasn't sufficiently worked out. The notion was that you can get community groups to deliver services rather than not just government, but private industry or NGOs. And you'll get citizens to form their own little collectives to deliver, was one of the ideas. Now, there are certain circumstances in which that might work. So I sympathize, but the narrative was just discredited. But if you can come up with a narrative which everybody within the policy area can at least subscribe to, in part at least, nobody will ever buy into the whole narrative all the time, but buy into the bulk of it, then that again is a way of pointing people in the direction and keeping them going where you want to go. Again, can I just express my slight unease at saying this, because of course it sounds as if this is the center manipulating networks and localities elsewhere, and I am uncomfortable with the idea that that is what we should be doing. But I mean, this old notion of narratives has now become a big business. There is, do you have the Dummies series of books in Mexico? The Dummies book on your iPhone, etc. Well, believe it or not, there's a Dummies book on storytelling for business.
Oh.
Okay, and just like your Dummies book tells you how to use your iPhone, this tells you how to use stories within your organization in order to get your own way. Now that's how far we've traveled down the narrative path. And Jacob is quite right. You know, your public servant could read Dummies, the Dummies book on storytelling and use that to steer a network if they wanted. But it makes me slightly uneasy because it has elements of manipulation in it.
Sure. One more, maybe the last one. How do we approach transitions in terms of these, frameworks? We still have a big deal of new public management working out in Latin America, and I'm sure in other countries with these results-based approaches in the public administration. And how can we approach these new frameworks of meta-governance and decentralized governance in order not to supplant them, but to coexist and not to make a either-or decision?
Mm-hmm. It's like research into dinosaurs. And you get the geological strata, and at different levels in the strata, you find different kinds of dinosaurs. Well, that's what this lot is. I mean, bureaucracy is still there. It's still important. It will persist. Aspects of the new public management are still there. They will persist. To that, we now add call it decentered governments, call it local knowledge, whatever phrase you prefer, is another layer to add to it. And all of these strata leave some residues behind.
Sure.
And the way it works is not because there's some big intellectual rationale for it. I mean, they remain because they work. I mean, that's what I think our public service is quite good at. I mean, whilst they might object to some big reform, as they do what they're told, they will find bits of it that really work, and so they'll keep them. And there's no great intellectual rationale for keeping that particular reform other than it works. And that, I think, is what happens here. We get geological strata of reforms, and what gets left over is the bit that actually works for that bureaucracy at that point in time. And then when it stops working, it'll just sink back down into the geological strata for historians of administrative reform to come along and find.
Great analogy. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, I think that unfortunately, time's always the biggest tyrant in these joyful experiences that we have. We would like to invite Professor Rhodes, if you would like to close with some key ideas. We've delightfully know now about tons of skills that we have to develop. I think that those are important skills not only for academical sectors, but also for NGOs and public servants, and in order to gather an environment of dialogue and public deliberation, negotiation, steering that we all need to develop in the actual or in nowadays context. So we are really thankful for that. And if you would please close with ideas that you would like to share with us, Professor Rhodes.
Yes, in fact, this is courtesy of my PhD student who read the paper and told me what I got wrong. Wonderful things, PhD students. And she highlighted this particular passage in it, which I actually think she's quite right. It does get to the heart of what I was trying to say, that what I'm about is recovering local knowledge, of using storytelling as a way of recovering that knowledge, of looking at the context within which the stories are told. And I think that delivers supplementary knowledge for elite decision-making, but there are two dangers. Danger number one is that it's dismissed by central elites as irrelevant, and it is captured by and used for their own purposes by local elites. So that's sort of the main message of what I'm trying to get across. The other thing, which it's not actually in the paper, but seems to me to have emerged, is that we do need to add observational fieldwork as an important a tool methodologically for us as the sample survey. And to all those Sheldon Coopers out there who think surveys are wonderfully safe, allow me to tell you that you will grow massively if you actually undertake observational fieldwork. Even Sheldon improves through the series. I got a visiting professorship at the University of Leiden. I didn't know anybody, and it's a lovely flat. I'm not criticizing the university, but boy, was I bored at 9 o'clock at night. And I put the television on, and there was Sheldon Cooper. I had never seen the program before, and I thought Sheldon was hilarious. So I've now watched every series of it. So if you wonder why I keep mentioning Sheldon Cooper, it's because it's another one of those crappy American sitcoms that it's one of the ones I actually love. I didn't do Friends, I didn't do Frasier, I do Sheldon Cooper.
Thank you so much, Professor
I've got
Rhodes.
a silly question right at the end. My given name is Roderick. Okay, so what's the Mexican version or the Spanish version of Roderick? Is it Rodriguez?
It will be, I guess it would be Rodrigo.
Rodrigo, okay, right. Well, I have to say, this, just to finish on one of Rhodes's idiot notes yet again, one of my favorite film directors, along with Tarantino, is, of course, Robert Rodriguez. And 2 nights ago on British television, they had Once Upon a Time in Mexico, and it is a great movie. Do you know it? Is it a big one in Mexico? Did everybody like it in Mexico, or did they think it insulted the country?
Well, I think that it mostly was liked, but I think that it was also a point of debate.
Oh yes, no. I mean, the point is, I don't believe it in a realistic. I don't think it's realist at all. But I did think it's enormously funny at times, and great fun. I don't think Tarantino actually reflects American society either, but I do think he's great fun. It's all the expression is it's self-referential. Right?
Yeah, I agree.
Tarantino feeds off old types of movies, and Rodrigo does exactly the same thing. He feeds off other kinds of movies, and the trick is to spot which movie he happens to be quoting at this point in time, because you don't get footnotes with films explaining these things to you.
So we are really grateful for this great experience with your keynote lecture. And it's such a humane approach, as Dr. Carlos Navarrete was saying. We are so used to read you, and now hear you and look at you, and your corporal expressions are just really a humane experience for all of us. There are tons of bravos in the chat section, and tons of congratulations for this lecture. Many thanks, Professor Rhodes.
Sorry. The other thing which is really irritating is when I write for academic journals, etc., or even sometimes when I write for the university presses and do books, they won't let me use the stories because they don't think they're serious. And that is really irritating. And one of the, Public Administration Review I published in a year or so ago, and they wouldn't even let me use the pronoun I. They insisted I had to talk about we, which is just stupid. Aren't we? There is no we, Rod Rhodes. There's only me. And we lock ourselves into these traditions about how we present our research, and we make our research a lot more boring than it needs to be because we're not allowed to write it in a humane way. I'm delighted you think it's humane, by the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So definitely we are pleased, and it's an honor that you shared those stories here. And consider us and the thematic network on governance the place to share all of those narratives and stories and all that rich insights that you've shared with us. There are obviously there are a lot of comments and questions that couldn't be discussed in this lecture and in this dialogue. How can we reach you, Professor Rhodes? You have a personal website, I think that's located on...
The best way to reach me is on the front page of the article I sent you. It's got my email address. Yeah. So just use the email address. It's much the quickest and easiest way. I do use Facebook and some of the other things, but I don't use Twitter. I don't like Twitter. Well, what can I say? A certain person uses it, and how could I possibly do what he does?
Okay. Many thanks. So, with this really great keynote lecture from Professor Rhodes, Public Governance, Trends and Issues, we thank everyone in Mexico, in Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, Colombia, Spain, for this great sharing. Please, you can download the speaking notes from Professor Rhodes in the website, and in chat, in the section chat, you can find that link. So please feel free to go there and download them, and we'll be facilitating communications with Professor Rhodes and all the published materials that he has shared with us. So thank you, Dr. Marco Berger, Dr. Juan Ángel de Merutis for your moderation. Dr. Carlos Navarrete, many thanks, and a big and a warm salute to Professor Rhodes.
Oh, thank you very much for organizing it. I have enjoyed myself.
Thanks, Professor.
Take care. Stay healthy.
Stay healthy,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bien, amigos, voy cerrando entonces oficialmente la sesión.
Gracias, Álvaro, Carlos.
Gracias, Marco, al contrario. Gracias, Álvaro. Gracias a la
Amigo
traductora.
Marco, muchas gracias.
Marisol. Claro.
No comentamos en público, pero creo que todavía está abierto. Marisol, muchas gracias por tu esfuerzo.
Gracias, Marisol.
Qué amable, gracias. Por ahí nos vemos ahorita en el otro canal de las 13 horas, ¿verdad, Álvaro?
Es correcto, si por aquí continúan algunos colegas, estamos comenzando, aunque un poquito tal vez tarde, dos de los paneles, uno coordinado por el doctor Carlos Navarrete y su servidor, otro precisamente coordinado por el doctor Juan Ángel de Merutis. Nos vemos en unos 15 minutitos en las otras salas. Recordar que todos los canales para la comunicación están abiertos en el sitio de internet que en el chat ustedes pueden encontrar. Y comentar brevemente que todas las preguntas que fueron vertidas en el chat de Q&A van a ser compartidas con el profesor Rhodes vía correo electrónico, de manera que pueda en algún momento contestarlas. Agradecemos muchísimo a todos en Bolivia, en Perú, en Brasil. Muchas gracias por su compañía y continuamos con el cuarto coloquio de Internacional Gobernanza Metropolitana.